I want to welcome you all to the Excel Catlin and Sullivan Group webinar series. Today's topic is cybersecurity, exploring the healthcare risk manager's role in reducing the frequency and severity of data loss. I am honored to have with me Chris Roberts, who is the founder and CTO of One World Labs. Some of you might recognize him. He's recently been featured on some news programs regarding exposing security flaws in commercial aviation. He directs information security strategy for Fortune 500 organizations and is a frequent lecturer and presenter on cybersecurity and threat intelligence. And me, for those of you who don't know me personally, I am a certified professional in healthcare risk management. I am an active member of the risk management community as the president-elect of my local chapter of ASHRM called CHARM. I'm also the chair of the ASHRM Webinars Task Force. Cyber risk management is not generally something that is included in our job descriptions as healthcare risk managers, but nowadays we're seeing it included in the insurance that we're purchasing and we're having to manage. And we're noticing that the cases impacting healthcare are on the rise. So I just wanted to establish that we see cyber risk as an enterprise risk, and it crosses multiple ASHRM enterprise risk management domains, most notably technology, operations, legal, regulatory, and strategic and reputation. I also thought it would be helpful for us as risk managers to be really grounded, and this is familiar territory for us. We're used to talking in terms of frequency and severity of things, so if we think about today's presentation as decreasing the frequency with which the data escapes unprotected and decreasing the severity of a breach through early detection and mitigation, all of which will reduce our claims. Our objectives for today's presentation include helping you to integrate information security into the healthcare risk manager practice in a more meaningful way. We're hoping to provide insight into the forensic process that follows a breach discovery. We want to illustrate a few everyday opportunities that lend themselves to becoming breaches, discuss a few emerging concerns, and then finally finish off by outlining a few strategies to manage these risks. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Chris Roberts.
Hey guys. So I think this next slide probably illustrates some of what we're talking about, and this is pulled in from a couple of other presentations we've done. We tend to talk about data and how we lose data, and this really illustrates the volume of data that we watch on a monthly basis. As it notes on there, we bring in about 750 million verified targets for us. That's an IRC channel, a message group, an FTP forum, or something on the dark net where the organizations themselves have actually lost information, lost data, or are having their data bought, sold, or traded. As it notes on there, we're finding about 500,000 live usable credit cards, about 500,000 PHI records, and about 150,000 live identities being traded on a monthly basis. From our standpoint, what we're trying to do is help organizations to understand how to protect themselves, their organizations, and their patients as well. We're obviously looking to close the gap between the actual breach itself and the actual discovery of a breach. It's one of those things that's obviously challenging, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. But, you know, unfortunately what's happening is it's at least 6 to 9 months of data leakage and data loss is actually occurring before anybody understands the breach. And obviously we're taking a look at actually how to educate yourselves as well. From the landscape standpoint, obviously what we're taking a look at here is the survey that was actually done by RIMS on this one as well. It's really taking a look at the order where cybersecurity, unfortunately, within healthcare is now playing catch-up. Unfortunately, in the banking and the retail side of the world, they've obviously had these issues for a considerable amount of time. You look at the SCADA, the FERC, and the NERC areas as well. They've been working to catch up on this one. Healthcare, unfortunately, it's taken its time. It's catching up, but it's definitely taken its time in how to catch up on this.
Some of you may recognize this study, most recently published an update. This was in May, and I just want to highlight from a top level some of the findings from this report. And while we know that Ponyman is heavily relied upon in healthcare, I know, Chris, you've got some thoughts on the use of this data and how we might look at this data, and hopefully you can help us understand along the way what this data is telling us, what it might not be telling us, and where it might be creating some confusion for us. But before I move on, I just want to highlight that the most recent report stated that criminal attacks in healthcare are up 125% since 2010. The average cost of a data breach for healthcare organizations is estimated to be more than $2.1 million. And I want to emphasize that in the survey, these respondents were basing this on approximately 2,700 lost or stolen records, which is not, as we all know, a large amount. So that's a high cost for not many records. And they also outline that medical identity theft victims spend an average of $13,500 to restore their credit and repair the damage left in the wake.
So, I mean, this next slide really goes against the cost of cybersecurity. I'm going to use the word cyber, for which I'm probably going to have a shot every single time I see everybody at DEF CON and B-Side later on this year. As it shows up here, I mean, we're really looking at the financial cost, the technical cost, the business cost, and everything else. From a breach standpoint, obviously, these days definitely resulting in penalties and claims from the authorities. The negative publicity, obviously, on this one is a fairly large one. That's arguable these days, given the amount of breaches there are and how, unfortunately, one is tending to get lost among the woods, among the trees, unfortunately, unless it's one of the mega breaches, in which case it's front-page newspaper. Obviously, the business continuity, the loss and destruction of original data files, those things we're seeing quite a lot of, unfortunately, where somebody's coming in and not just harvesting data, but also modifying and manipulating data. We had a case fairly recently where, unfortunately, somebody went through some fairly extensive medical records and adjusted some of the patient's information on what they were coming in for operations on. Not a good thing to happen to your data. And then obviously from the mega breaches, you've got class action lawsuits. We're working on a couple of cases at the moment where organizations that we've been involved with, when we've come in after the breaches occurred to help do triage and help them actually get better, have obviously faced a lot of legal time and legal expenses. So unfortunately, these are just some of the costs that nobody really tends to think about sometimes.
So according to a 2014 study done by Negligence, cyberclaims, they outlined that during the assessment of the cost to manage a breach claim, that 48% of the cost goes to what they call crisis services, which in other words is cleanup. So forensics, notification, legal guidance, public relations. 17% goes to fines, 15% to legal defense, and 10% to legal settlements.
I think this next one actually brings in some interesting points. You've obviously seen the average cost paid, and the cost paid here is from an internal cost as to how much the organization is likely to be paying out for that record. This doesn't go into obviously how much the darknet or how much individuals are paying for those stolen records. I think the other one that's worth noting here is the second bullet point. Obviously, Anthems should expect to pay, X amount on these ones. My biggest challenge here, obviously, is they're not likely to be paying 8 to 16 billion, but they will spend millions on legal fees to defend how much they should be paying. No different, unfortunately, than we're seeing currently in some of the retail spaces at the moment. So let's take a look at the next area of concern, and this is something for those of us that are actually listening in on the information security side of the house are very well aware of. Unfortunately, I think healthcare is getting a bit of a rude awakening, which is the warnings about the vulnerabilities in devices inside healthcare. Typically, we tend to think about security as being the server, the PC, the laptop, and the various other EMR systems. What we tend not to think about are those devices that are coming into the healthcare environments these days. In the case we have on here are the infusion pumps, the weakness allowing a remote access and dose modification. For those of us that have had friends we've lost over the years through various different issues to do with insulin pumps and various other things, we're acutely aware, obviously, of all the issues and challenges. I think, again, this is one area where healthcare is playing catch-up and not, unfortunately, doing a very good job of it. Obviously, here you've got the FDA continue to issue warnings, and obviously the White House, their coordinator, is now saying, hey, we have issues, we have challenges, and the organizations themselves, the development systems, the manufacturers are now having to pay much more attention to what they're putting into the healthcare systems. So another one that we're taking a look at, obviously some pretty interesting and fairly standard statistics that we're all fairly well of. 65% of healthcare organizations and the business associates that go with it experiencing incidents over the past 2 years. We're obviously, if you follow the trends, if you look at anything with privacyrights.org or any of the other outlets that actually demonstrate the risks and the breaches that are happening, we can see that healthcare is getting picked on very, very heavily, along with several other industries. Why? Because they're an easy target and because they have all sorts of data. They have the healthcare, they have the patient data, they have the credit card data and everything else. It's unfortunately almost a one-stop shop for the criminal side of the world. Next stats down, 56% of healthcare organizations and BAs don't believe their incident response procedures have adequate funding and resources. That one's rather frustrating, to be perfectly honest, considering how much free information is out there and how many resources these guys actually have and you guys actually have to rely upon. It's a little frustrating to see that these things are actually not happening, and obviously to see that the funding itself isn't being pointed in this direction. And then obviously the majority of both organizations failed to perform a risk assessment, let alone, any kind of an audit or a security incident. It's a challenge because obviously the federal organizations are saying you have to do it, yet they're not necessarily doing. And again, as we all know, performing one security assessment every year does nothing more than do a single point in time. It's one of those things where you look at a reactive versus a proactive solution. If we take a look at this, it's a fairly busy slide, but it tends to actually be fairly useful because it's showing the trending on the attacks. The top part, if you look really, the criminal attacks have gone from 20% up to 45%. It's useful to note that obviously the criminal element is again realizing that there's a lot of good data, and in the last couple of years they've obviously upped their efforts. The lost or stolen computing devices has remained fairly consistent. Again, it's pretty frustrating given the fact that encryption, it's free if you want to put it out that way. It's minimal cost. We have the ability to protect these devices, yet we continue to not even take the basic security measures. Employee actions are still around about the same thing. For that, there's education. Why are we not taking the time to educate people? And then you keep going down and down and down on the statistics. This is an interesting one. I think a lot of time and effort is spent by probably the media and other outlets to say that everybody on the outside is trying to take data, and the criminals are always out there trying to take data. But what they tend not to really focus on is, as the left-hand slide says, is the employee negligence. I mean, we have 70 to 75% of the issues is employee negligence, and that's a fairly wide swathe of areas that we can focus on with this one. I think that the one that we're looking at here is really an action on the outside is obviously going to be much more successful when the inside controls, the inside individuals, are not adequately protected. Again, it's something I've talked to a couple of times, and it's something that we're talking to in the future is, if we can't protect the human, how do we actually remove the human from the situation? So a useful slide to take away. And as you guys go back and you talk to your organizations, it's fairly useful to take these statistics and say, hey, we cannot just focus on the inside, or we cannot not just focus on the firewall or on the outside. This is one whole issue that we have to be aware of. You have to look at it from a holistic standpoint, protecting the users, the technology, both on the inside and on the outside. All right, so I have an issue with this one because at the very top one we have audit and assessment bundled into the same statistic. Again, for those of us that are in this business, we know that those are two very, very, very different solutions. And for those of you not in the business, an audit basically means I sit here and I ask you lots of questions, and you can choose to answer truthfully or otherwise. And an assessment means I'm going to sneak in at 3 o'clock in the morning and take your damn data. Obviously, two very separate sets of results, but unfortunately here they're bundled in. But what's interesting on this one is it took an audit and an assessment in 69% of the cases to actually understand that a breach was occurring, which in itself is, again, kind of scary, because the previous statistic says most of you don't actually do any of this, so how are you actually going to know that you've had a breach? The upside is at least once a year you're going to know whether you've been breached or not. 44% employee detection. Again, we're not really relying upon the best resources we have, which are the humans, to help actually protect ourselves. We look at the patient complaint accident, and then down the bottom, Unfortunately, we have law enforcement, which is going to be the detection, which is when you get the phone call from the FBI saying, congratulations, you are the common point of compromise, not the telephone call that you want to have. And again, one of the big nasty statistics is time to discovery. Without any kind of a proactive solution, you're looking at least 6 to 9 months before you realize that your data has left the building. So I think this is a useful one because obviously we're talking about, the trending on here, the technological effects that actually how we're trying to affect and how we're actually trying to detect breaches. We're taking a look at the people themselves and then the policies and procedures. Again, going into a lot of organizations, we unfortunately realized that a lot of their policies, procedures, and controls are just not in place, let alone the technology to actually back up what they're actually trying to say. And then on top of that, we layer the human who is meant to be educated to understand the controls, let alone the technology that's being put in front of them. So we look at 2015, we're actually seeing, how those things are being implemented, and again, not very effectively. We can do a lot better job, and I think part of my challenge here is obviously if we look at policies and we look at people, those are, to be honest, fairly cheap solutions that can be implemented. This is the low-hanging fruit. Educating people can be free. Putting the policies, procedures, and controls in place is low cost. Buying those expensive solutions from the IT providers, which quite honestly most of the time don't do anything better, is to some degrees a bit of a waste of money at the moment. Get the other things fixed first. Oh, I'm doing this one. Sorry. All right, so let's take a look at how people are getting in, what is actually happening, and some of the top ones that are out there. Obviously, the internal threats, the organization you have, your business associates, what is it? Business, I always get confused. We call them vendors and suppliers, but your business associates, the consultants, and everybody else. The challenge here, again, we are still seeing lost laptop and USB drives. We've had solutions out there for years on this. We still don't seem to be able to implement them effectively and efficiently. The theft and the fraud, obviously, the opportune side of the world from an internal standpoint, and then the exploited by external individuals or entities. We'll talk a little bit further on about this, but the phishing and the hacking side of the world. Again, human education. We take a look at the external threats that are out there. Extortion is one that is slowly but surely trending upwards, and there's several different facets to this. Anything from simply, I have your data and I'm going to release it, to I have encrypted your data and you will pay me to get the encryption key back again so you can continue to work. And then obviously the hacking devices to cause harm to people. That one we've started to see in the wild a little bit more, and we have a bit of a discussion on that a little bit later. And then obviously accessing systems to steal information. Unfortunately, again, in most cases, those systems are not adequately protected.
So now we get to the fun part of the presentation. What we've prepared today are a couple case studies that outline what a breach really looks like from our perspective. So this first case is called Let's Go Fishing. So I'm going to let Chris walk you through kind of the facts here.
So this is actually taken from a couple of different situations that we've unfortunately had to be involved in. And for those of you in the industry, you will recognize this very much so. For those of you who are calling in on the healthcare side of the house, this unfortunately is very typical of how an operation is run against you. And in the case here, obviously, it was pretty much so discovered by the IT side of the guys. What ends up typically happening is OWL or a similar type of an organization will get called in under either IT or IT security to take a look at the organization specifically from the outside. Threat intelligence, how we look at it is understanding what data is already out there about you. And in this case, what we unfortunately discovered that was one of the clients we were working with was actually their data was being sold basically on the darker side of the net and on the blacker side of the world. We obviously identified it, we found it, we pulled the data back, we identified it, we told our client what was going on, and at this point in time, unfortunately, the information security team basically started to pull logs and trace the origins of the breach. Once we started to look at the log systems, they realized that about 6 months beforehand, that some information was starting to go out via the regular web browser, exactly the same thing that you use to browse the internet. That was being used to basically exfiltrate a lot of their data from the EMR systems and was basically being stored over in China, Latvia, and Germany, and various other organizations or various other locations. It is one of those things where you have to say, okay, why did it take engaging an external organization to do nothing more than actually say, hey, what data is out there about us, in order for us to realize that basically our data was leaving the organization. I mean, it was 6+ months worth of data that was leaving the organization.
And Chris, before we move on to the next slide, I just have a quick question for you. I know this was new to me when I first met you, what is this dark web? Can you just for a moment tell us what is the dark web?
Yeah, definitely. The dark web to us is pretty well defined as everything that is hidden behind what's known as Tor and Onion. It is a set of servers that have a level of anonymity, and behind that is where a lot of data is bought, sold, traded. You can do everything from buy credit card information to buy credit cards to buy passports. If you fancy having somebody assassinated, you can pay your bitcoins and get them assassinated. And I think this, unfortunately, a lot of people sounds fairly far-fetched, but to those of us that are in this industry and in the trenches a lot, this is life. This is unfortunately where a lot of this data is bought, sold, and traded.
Thank you. All right. So we thought we'd pause for the moment and give everyone, kind of a question to think internally based on the facts of the case that we just presented. We're all kind of wondering, like, are we covered for that? So I just thought it was a good moment to tie it in with insurance and ask that question. So we're not actually going to answer that one for you. We're just going to leave it there. Moving on. So let's go back to this case and learn a little bit about what actually happened.
So in this specific case, we were actually able to get to root cause. And again, for most of us, unfortunately, that work in this industry, the smoking gun and the root cause is not always identifiable. But in this case, it was. What had actually happened was a phishing campaign. So when you get the email that comes in saying, congratulations, you are the millionth winner, or congratulations, your great aunties died in Nigeria, and P.S., just sign on the dotted line here, or any of these other emails, or hey, sign up for this webinar, sign up for what's going on, those are typically, for a lot of that stuff can be phishing campaigns. In the case of this one, it was a tactic that actually OWL tends to use as well. We will actually fire up a web server that looks very much like your company's branded server. In this case, emails were sent into many of the internal employees of the target company, and they were told that they'd had a third-party company was doing some extra work for them, and to make life easier for them, they could log into this company's web server using their basically their login credentials they use every single day of the week. So when they went to the third-party company, it presented them with a web portal that looked exactly like their own company's web portal. They typed in their user IDs, they typed in their credentials, they typed in their passwords. They were redirected to another page saying coming soon, and then obviously those credentials were harvested. In the case of what we noted, of the several hundred click-throughs of people that actually hit this web server, 95% of them provided their login, user ID, and password to this website. It basically harvested most of the people that actually put their data out there. And obviously, as the last bullet point says, those credentials were then used to penetrate back straight into the healthcare organization. Legitimate credentials were used to basically siphon off the EMR system. They were used to siphon off all the records, the patient data, the cardholder data, the whole lot.
So, Chris, a couple slides ago, we were looking at reported causes from the Pokemon data, and we had employee negligence rated as pretty high. We had criminal attacks as rated as high in another slide. And so in this case, would you classify this as the result of an internal or an external threat?
I think, unfortunately, it's really classified as both. Obviously, from an inside standpoint, if I'm sending in a phishing email and it's arriving on your desktop, that's a bit of a failure of any of the perimeter security you have potentially, especially if it's not able to recognize malicious or payloads, or if it's not able to recognize that a non-site is being sent to multiple hundreds of people. I mean, there are ways of obviously protecting against that. Then obviously you have the internal awareness, the fact that 95% of the people click through and actually put in their login credentials to a website that obviously wasn't theirs. Nobody really decided to call up the help desk or security or anybody else and actually validate this, let alone HR. And then obviously on the outside, the guys that are launching the attacks that set up the fake website that obviously scraped a portal and the organization itself. And then from their standpoint, once they'd actually gotten onto some of the computers, they put basically what's known as a Trojan on it, and they put a botnet architecture on the inside, and it kept on regularly calling back to their servers for additional updates to scrape additional types of data. So really, in this case, you have both internal and external types of attacks.
Thanks, Chris. So when we were working on this case, I wanted to maybe have some real examples. So I went into my own email account, and in a matter of a couple of days, I was able to pull these examples. All of them were sent from companies that I do business with, and if I were in a hurry, I would click a link. Oh no, something's happened. I need to verify my account. I click the link, I enter my details, and I'm on one of those fake sites, and somebody's just gotten my login to my bank or my system. So I thought that was really scary that I was just able to find this many examples over the course of a couple of days. All right, the second case has to do with a lost USB drive, and this case is pulled from a course that I authored for the Sullivan Group called Information Security Tips for Healthcare Providers, so I'm going to take this one. So the background of this case, and this is one that I created, but I pulled from the privacyrights.org website as a fact-based background for it. So in this particular situation, there was an EMR system conversion. It was only about 5,000 records, so it was a small practice. Approximately 1,000 of those records didn't pull through into the new system. And Chris, I know you have some thoughts about data mapping that you might be able to share with us in this regard.
Yeah, I think it's probably one of those things, unfortunately, that raises eyebrows, where you see that 5,000 records are being mapped into a new system and 1,000 of them did not pull through. Unfortunately, that tends to be reality these days. It's fairly regular that with some of the work that we've done on mapping across the systems, that at least 20 to 30 to 40% of the records will not pull through on the first or second attempt. So that's a fairly real-world kind of number.
Thank you. So in this case, the office manager for the practice volunteered to do it from home. She said, I'll grab all the records, I'll make sense of them and get them uploaded. And so the IT department loaded all the records onto a USB drive and they encrypted it. And they wrote a password on a Post-it. And the office manager put both of those in a specimen jar so she could throw it in her purse and wouldn't lose it, and headed home. At some point on her way home, it fell out of her purse. So she reports it immediately to IT and to the privacy officer that was assigned to that practice. Notification is sent out to 1,000 patients as quickly as they could. Notification obviously was made to the media and to HHS. And ID theft monitoring was purchased for those patients. The local and regional news media were notified. When they were notified, they did go ahead and run stories. So that's definitely not the situation you want to be in. And of course, we can see where this might go. 2 years later, several of those patients whose records were lost filed lawsuits as a result of damages caused by identity theft. So again, this one just kind of highlights an everyday situation that could turn into a breach. So just wanted to share insights with you. All right, moving on, we're going to get to something a little bit more out there. So I'm going to hand it back over to Chris to lead us through the next case.
All right, now we have a little bit of fun with this one. So this actually takes something that we are aware of that has been attempted before, and we took a little bit of a challenge on it and said, okay, what's been done, what's not been done, and how. So in this case, we have a high-profile, you guys can read as well as I can, a high-profile politician is actually brought in for elective surgery. Obviously, high-profile means that it's in the news, somebody knows what's going on, somebody's doing what's known as open-source research. So they're actually finding the intelligence to understand the who, the what, the where, and the why that this individual is coming in, which at which point now makes your healthcare system the target. Obviously, paparazzis are a problem. They are most of the time infiltrating all areas of the hospital. So basically, security staff have been brought in. So at which point in time, in theory, you've got the physical side of the world sorted out. What you haven't, obviously, as we keep going through this, is the electronic side of the world. Surgery uneventful. Day after the surgery, the patient's resting quietly in a room when the alarms suddenly go off at the nursing station. Patient's vitals have dropped suddenly and he goes into a cardiac arrest. Revival efforts are unsuccessful and our unfortunately high-profile politician is dead. So as far as actually backing out of this, staff are perplexed and the autopsy is performed, the result of which, on this case, basically an overdose of the pain medication. Going back to the earlier area that we were talking about and some of the disclosures, excuse me, it's actually, as the technical and the forensics are done, it actually looks like the pump in this case was accessed remotely from a server overseas. Now, it all sounds a little far-fetched until you actually take a step back. Getting into the healthcare system itself, not that hard. Getting into the systems that actually control the pumps, that control the emergency system rooms, those are typically on, unfortunately, a fairly flat network. Therefore, if I'm in the regular healthcare part of the network, I can very easily get across to these areas. Influencing the pump systems, again, as has already been identified and noted, there are now exploits way out there in the wild that can actually do this. And in this case, actually, the server's linked to an extremist group, and the internet chatter seems to point to malicious tampering. It, again, sounds a little far-fetched, but it's one of those things, as we've taken a step back and we've looked at this, it is now possible and has been done to be able to get into these systems to influence them in a negative manner. Again, I'm doing this remotely. I'm not physically having to go in and kill somebody. I am able to action this remotely.
So Chris, I know that I took a lot of creative liberty with that case, but, you know, just kind of taking it really to the worst case scenario. But I also recognize that there's something else that these devices, that the vulnerabilities in these devices, I guess they have, they use default passwords and user accounts and things like that. So what else could somebody do if they, with these devices? They're networked, they've got default credentials in use. What can somebody do with that?
I mean, you can do any number of things. You can turn them on, you can turn them off. We've recognized when we've done penetration testing inside healthcare systems, and we've actually identified it with other companies that have done the same thing. A lot of the medical equipment is not necessarily able to withstand a simple scan of the network. So if I'm doing a regular pen test and I want to scan the network, I scan specific healthcare systems, they will fail. They will reboot, they will restart, they will go into an overflow mode, at which point in time, if it's connected to a person, something negative is going to happen. We've notified that, we've seen that, we've identified it. And then in the case of this one, being able to remotely access and control it via basically a command line interface and adjust stuff. There's more than one way. All you have to do is basically take a look at what's known as the Internet of Things and the Internet of Everything, take all of the issues and challenges there, apply that to healthcare, and you're going to have some interesting issues.
So another question I have for you as it pertains to this is, could somebody use those devices as a passageway to get into your network? I mean, are they an access point?
To some degree, some of them definitely are. Those that actually have some kind of remote reporting capability or have a capability to get out to maybe back into the manufacturer's network or the systems network, or if you have physicians working in remote locations and somebody needs to monitor those from elsewhere, then obviously, yeah, that's one definite way into the network. And again, unfortunately, the challenge is a lot of these systems are on a very, very what's known as a flat network. There's limited segmentation, there's limited separation between critical core systems and regular front or back-end business architectures.
I think what I was most surprised by when I was doing a little bit of research for this case is the extent to which the FDA has come out with recommendations, and that caught me by surprise. So most notably, they actually have an advisory from the Industrial Control Systems Cyber Emergency Response Team. So they actually have a group that's assembled that is dedicated solely to these issues. And so I've just pulled a couple of the highlights that I got from the FDA website as it pertains to this issue, because again, they were news to me. So I apologize if this is a repeat for anyone else, but I'll scroll through the next two slides that I have just to highlight some key points. So the FDA has very specific recommendations for good cybersecurity hygiene practices. So they've outlined those pretty clearly for us here. And again, for those of you who are interested, this webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to access it at a later time and go back through any of this. And if you want to, you can always just Google and find this, because it is freely available. And then finally, what I also thought was interesting is that the FDA wants some help. So they've come up with a list of questions that they'd love for us to respond to if anything does happen. So that is again, just was news to me, so I figured it would be helpful to update. So really from there, I think we've kind of ended our case review and talking about all the problems. And so I thought that we might spend the rest of our time talking about solutions. So moving on. First up, I wanted to cover a few key points as they pertain to education, culture, and incident reporting, which are all things that the healthcare risk manager does on a regular basis. So education, we definitely want to make sure that we have a mechanism to provide all staff with baseline knowledge of how their actions may result in a breach. A lot of the breaches are the result of everyday situations that just go wrong. So raising the awareness of what you may be doing that is putting your organization at risk is somewhat important. Next up is culture. I think that folks are afraid to say something, that if something looks odd and doesn't look quite right, if they see a fishy email, so to say, that they feel comfortable bringing that forward and talking to someone about it, because that has the potential to stop things. And then finally, really more of a question for us than a solution, I apologize for that, is there anything that we can do with our existing incident reporting systems to help manage this? Stretching them beyond just tracking the traditional risk management or patient safety concerns that we're looking for, and thinking about having some codes built in there for, suspicious emails or internet behaviors, things like that. So I thought that might be something that we all could ask our IT departments to help guide us on, if that's even a possibility. And I'm going to move on to solutions from Chris.
All right, so I think this is one of the areas where obviously those of us that are listening in or on the IT side of it are hoping that this works with the healthcare side of the world as well. Obviously, when we tend to go in and do pen testing and assessment, or we tend to go in and actually do a maturity model review of an organization, we tend to notice that the healthcare and potentially the physicians and various other areas of the business aren't necessarily always working and collaborating with IT, and definitely vice versa. It's one of those where, unfortunately, that happens in a lot of the industries, but it's very, very noticeable inside the healthcare side. And it's one area where we try to bring everybody to the table at once, where there really has to be more collaboration with IT and much more collaboration with the information security staff. And it isn't just to do, as it says up on here, in policy commitments. It's everything. You bring in new systems. You are evaluating new technology. You bring in new pumps or whatever else it might be. We've got to make sure that both the business in the healthcare side of the world, the physicians, and IT are actually going to be able to actually collaborate and work together. Obviously, the other thing is, sit down and work with the IT security guys and say, what is in place? what do we have as an organization to help understand if we've been breached? What are we doing from a preventative standpoint? What are we doing from a proactive standpoint? The threat intelligence is but one facet of that in helping an organization to understand where it is, where its data is. One of the biggest things we tend to work when we're inside a healthcare company or organization is helping them understand where the data is, who has access to it, and how well is it protected. At that point in time, that becomes basically a center for collaboration between IT and between the business. So this, to me, is a very, very, very high priority one because I see it too many times when there's a breakdown in communication between the parts of the organization.
And Chris, if I could use this opportunity to, again, ask for a little clarification. I've got a lot of terms up here. I've got IT, I've got InfoSec, we're talking about cyber. Can you straighten me out about what's the difference between IT, information security, and cyber?
So typically, information technology is everything from the operations guys, the network guys, the server guys, the database guys, the help desk guys, the support guys, everybody who keeps your entire organization ticking. Information security can report in through information technology, can also go through legal and compliance, can go through risk, typically goes up to one of the C-level executives. And that area typically is responsible for the security organization. And it could be everything from monitoring the firewall rules, monitoring the information, the intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems, through working with the policies, the procedures, the controls, doing the assessments. So, when a new piece of technology comes into the organization, who's actually going to assess that it both fits from a technology standpoint, a security standpoint, and obviously the physician standpoint? All of those guys should be at the table. So the security guys tend to lead those charges. What else do we have in there? Threat intelligence is what it says it is. It's understanding everything that is outside of your four walls. Unfortunately, most organizations put up a firewall and go, ha-ha, we're safe and we're secure, which is absolutely no use whatsoever. It's better than nothing, but unfortunately the firewall is going to do nothing more than demonstrate where your data has gone. It's not actually going to stop the darn stuff.
So there is a difference between a firewall and threat intelligence monitoring.
Yeah, hugely so. For us, threat intelligence is really looking at the data where it is, typically outside of the four walls. In other words, we'll look at the business associates, the way we put it, the vendors and the partners. We'll look at who you're working with, and we'll look at who's talking about you. We'll take a look at where your data is outside there, who's collaborating, who unfortunately has maybe shared information about the internal organization they shouldn't have, be it the IT guys, be it the business, or whoever it might be that's basically putting the organization at risk.
So we saw on some earlier slides that the time to recognize that a breach is 6 to 9 months. Mm-hmm. What technologies would you think would be most effective for closing that gap and more timely recognition? Because it sounds like if we could only shorten that time from when a breach occurs to when it's actually detected and we can do something about it, we might stand a chance of recovering, mitigating some of this.
Yeah, I think it's definitely more mitigating. And potentially it's also, if you have been breached, it isn't necessarily that all of your data is left inside the first 24 hours. Obviously, if somebody's gotten into your system, they are potentially still learning about your system. They might have gotten into some of the subsets of the EMR system, so you'll have lost some of your data, but you wouldn't necessarily have lost all of your data. I think, unfortunately, once it's gone, it's gone. So we talk about technology, so let's talk about the human side just for a second. Let's talk about the education of the humans. That can be done through some very, very simple SANS training, the SANS courses are not expensive. They have a ton of stuff out there. Obviously, the Sullivan Group, who we're talking here as well, have got a ton of stuff out there to help organizations understand this. From a technology standpoint, you have tools in place that will understand the data that you are moving across your network, will either encrypt it or will limit its movement. the basics of encrypting the computers, the very computers we use to store the data on, encrypting the portable media that we use, making sure that the devices that we move our patients' healthcare information around on are actually secured themselves. I mean, those are very basic things, let alone the antivirus, the heuristics we have on there at a network layer, looking at everything at the perimeter from data leakage, data loss prevention, intrusion detection, something that will actually help you understand what is on your network. One of the biggest things, unfortunately, we recognize, not just in healthcare but other areas, is a lot of organizations don't even fully understand all the endpoints they have. So even a simple asset management program that tells you, hey, I have 3,000 devices or 300 devices on my network, yet only 200 of the darn things are actually being managed or monitored. So just understanding the basics will be a huge step forward.
Thank you. All right, and I also want to take just a moment to acknowledge our education partner here, Catlin. They have a pretty robust cyber liability program, and so they do offer services to support organizations. And I thought that was helpful just to quickly review on a top level what they can do to support all of us as we're navigating this territory. And then kind of finally, I wanted to spend a moment or two talking about some of TSG's courses, as I think they pertain to this topic. So we've got quite a few CME, continuing medical education courses, that we've developed over the years that I think hit on a lot of the issues that we've reviewed during today's presentation. Obviously, at the top of the list is the Information Security Tips for Healthcare Providers course. It's a short half-an-hour CME course that I authored with collaboration from Chris and the experts at OWL to just kind of set a baseline. So it's just a quick, easy course, and it rewards CME. Next up, we've got a more robust offering that was offered by John West. John West is a familiar face on the ASHRM circuit, and he's just a powerhouse when it comes to authoring courses. This one in particular, Confidentiality of Medical Information, Complying with HIPAA and State Law, is a pretty terrific course that highlights real cases that are out there so that we all can learn from those lessons. And then we've got courses developed by Arnie Mackles on the technology revolution, and he dives into the impact electronic medical record systems have had on practice, and I think that's important to be cognizant of that. Rewards to CMEs. An interesting course recently launched and not directly tied to cyber, but I think definitely related, is a course that Dr. Dan Sullivan, the founder of the Sullivan Group, produced this year, and it's called Batch Events, Catastrophic System Risk. And while we don't have, while it's not directly tied to cyber, I did want to include it here and highlight it for us, because as we saw many, many slides ago, we're now seeing mega breaches, and they're turning into class action lawsuits. So I think that this course also has some lessons to teach us in that regard. And then finally, we've got a course in development. So we're looking at another 1-hour CME course to really look into more of a cyber case law perspective. So that's just some of the stuff that we can do from an education standpoint to help combat some of these issues. And that's really all we have for today's presentation. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to move us on to questions from the audience. So we have two mechanisms you can use to ask questions. You can chat them to us using the WebEx chat window, or you can submit them using the Q&A. And I do notice that we've got a couple questions that have come in, so I'm just going to shift gears and move over and read off those questions so we can all benefit from them. Okay, the first one is it's a bit of a prickly one, but I'm gonna let Chris answer this one. It is what are your thoughts on Anthem's choice not to encrypt its data?
Yeah, I'm going to choose my words carefully on this one. I would argue I think it's the wrong choice, definitely, from a purely logical standpoint. However, knowing how much data they have, where that data is, the amount of databases, the amount of systems, and the amount of technology involved in understanding all of that, let alone actually finding the darn data, I can actually understand why they did not do that. I mean, I can understand them saying, hey, we're not going to encrypt it, we're just basically going to circle the wagons, and we are going to secure all the systems around it. Unfortunately, in this case, it wasn't necessarily the right choice because the wagons weren't circled quite as effectively or as efficiently as they should be. Obviously, my preference, I come from this field, so my preference is always to ensure that that data, no matter where it is at rest or in motion, is always encrypted. But understanding the volume and the size and the technology and all the other factors from a technical standpoint, let alone all the legal and all the executive factors for making sure the darn thing's actually going to get done, I can understand why they didn't do it, but I can't necessarily agree with that choice.
Thanks, Chris. If I could just build on that question a little bit, it sounds like encryption's pretty important, and in this case, I know that that would encryption have stopped it? Yeah.
Not necessarily, unfortunately, because I mean, the attackers were in the system far enough that, in all honesty, they could probably have found where the keys were and gotten hold of the passwords and the codes to decrypt the data in the first place. So, again, it comes down to I can encrypt it in one place, but unless I protect the keys or I protect the key store in the safe or I ensure that my encryption, the certificates or whatever, unless I ensure that that is also adequately protected, it's a half-assed job and you're better off spending your money doing other things.
So it's sort of like that case that we looked at earlier with the EMR system conversion where she put the password on a Post-it note and the device, which was encrypted, in one thing and lost both together.
Yeah, correct.
So it's kind of like that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we've had a couple of cases where we've gone on site and done assessments and the data's encrypted at rest. Then we've gone and hit the IT guys and we've run rampant through their network and their systems. We found the key safe where they keep all the encrypted passwords, and then some bright sparkers just putting the password on a text file in one folder down, at which point, game over.
Thanks, Chris. So I've got another question here, and I'm actually going to have you read this. It's a little too technical for me. So it says, are you seeing an increase in the use of
I2P for data exfiltration? Yeah, I mean, definitely there is an increased use of that, but however, unfortunately, there's still a lot of data exfiltration, which is happening just in regular I mean, we had one fairly recently where, the Oracle PeopleSoft environment, they basically dumped reports out to PDF by the hundreds and then just basically sent them out over an SFTP site. So, yeah, definitely I2P is used. However, we're seeing a lot of stuff going out over port 80 and then even getting smart about it and using SSL encryption over port 443. So, yeah, there's still, unfortunately, some very, very easy ways of getting data out that are still in use.
I know that made a lot of sense to you
a couple of the guys.
But I'm wondering, what is I2P?
It is, what's the best way of putting it? Think of like a messaging. When you use messaging and you use chat, it's another form of that. That's probably the easiest way I can explain it.
That helps. Thank you. We have another question here. It is alleged that healthcare is the most vulnerable industry sector in cyber attacks. Are people really buying health insurance identities to get covered procedures? Who loses when the stolen identity is accepted and services are performed? The hospitals?
That's a tough one. So is it the most vulnerable? I don't know if it is the most vulnerable. I think it's one of the most vulnerable, definitely. It's arguable that if you take a look at the SCADA environments, the stuff that looks after our electricity, our heating, and our power and our water, that they're also pretty darn vulnerable. We also know the statistics are out there. Healthcare has unfortunately lost hundreds and hundreds of millions of records. And those records are obviously being stolen for a reason. Is there a value to them? Yes, I can probably go onto the Tornet and tell you how much your record's worth very, very quickly. Most of us who are the technology guys here could probably do that too. And then who loses? I don't know. That's an interesting one. Obviously, the individual that's lost their record definitely loses because now they have to repair their record. They've now got to spend, as Jen said, in the order of $13,500 plus time and effort and lawyers and everything else to get their life and their identity back. Whether the hospital loses, the insurance company loses, I think everybody loses is probably the best flipping way of putting it, to be perfectly honest.
And I think I saw an article, and maybe you have a little bit more information on this, about purchasing those medical identities to bill through for fraudulent procedures. So it would turn into a insurance or Medicare fraud situation.
Yep. Correct. Yeah, totally.
Okay. All right. We've got just a couple minutes left, and I know there are some of you who are moving off to another meeting. So while we're waiting for other questions to come in, I'm just going to roll through the closing slides. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we've got a general evaluation that will appear once we conclude today's session, and we'd love to hear from all of you how we did and if there's anything we could do better in the future. And as I mentioned, we are recording today's broadcast, and we'll make that available on the TSG website in about a week. If you have any questions about anything that we talked about today, you can definitely reach out to Brant Ross at the Sullivan Group to get information about TSG's RSQ solutions. And if you have information about anything that was presented as it pertains to XL Catlin, please contact your Bermuda brokers. So with that, we have one final question. So looking for the slides. So we can certainly prepare the slides and get them posted for those of you. We'll get those out when we post the recording. And thank you for registering today, because as a result of your registration, we do have your email addresses. So we will make sure that you get notification when everything is posted so that you can avail yourselves of those resources. And we hope you enjoyed the presentation today. If we don't have any other questions, I'd say we can conclude with a minute to spare. So thank you, everybody, so much. Chris.
Thanks very much, guys. Thanks, everybody, for attending.
All right.
Take care, guys.
All right. Have a great weekend, everybody. Thank you.